The shatter of a ceramic coffee mug against the cold steel deck was the loudest sound in the room. Commander Yale Dagen. The shatter of a ceramic coffee mug against the cold steel deck was the loudest sound in the room. Commander Yale Dagen did not flinch, did not swear, and did not look down at the dark liquid pooling around her boots. Her eyes were locked on the central console of Orbital Defense Platform 7. 1 second ago, the tactical display had shown the empty, quiet black of the lunar perimeter. Now it was bleeding red. A low, rhythmic mechanical thrum resonated through the floor plating, vibrating up into her teeth. The station's proximity alarms were screaming. "Report," Yale said. Her voice was flat, perfectly steady, stripping the panic out of the air before it could infect her crew. Lieutenant Owen Price, his face completely drained of blood under the emergency strobes, swallowed hard. 300 vessels, Commander. They dropped out of transit jump simultaneously. Formation is a standard siege pattern. Yale stepped up to the primary glass. Out there, beyond the thick atmospheric shielding, the stars were being blotted out. These were not ships in any human sense. They were drifting metallic mountains, casting immense jagged shadows across the moon's surface. The smallest frigate in the vanguard dwarfed Earth's heaviest dreadnought. But it was the vessel sitting dead center at the rear of the formation that made Osai. The air in the command center turned to ice. It was impossibly vast, motionless, covered in sprawling bioluminescent sigils that pulsed with a slow, living heartbeat in the vacuum of space. It was not a warship, it was a throne. The communication console shrieked. A broadcast overrode every encrypted human channel, blasting through the platform's speakers in a heavy synthesized machine drone. This message is addressed to the planet designated Earth. You are now eligible for tributary integration into the Veth Dominion. You have 72 hours to acknowledge the authority of Emperor Veth Karal and submit. Failure to comply is a declaration of extinction. The transmission snapped shut. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every officer on the deck turned to look at Yale. General Aldridge's voice cracked over the Emergency War Council feed a moment later, heavy with the weight of 40 billion lives. "Commander Dagen, they outmatch us 10,000 to 1. If we fight, we are a crater. What is your read?" Yale kept her eyes on that massive, glowing throne ship sitting lazily behind the enemy lines. She watched the way its escort ships drifted in wide, predictable, lazy circles. They were sloppy. They had never been threatened. "We do not fight their war," Yale said, her voice dropping to a quiet, absolute certainty. "We fight ours. General, I need the captured Veth diplomatic shuttle from Lunar Storage Bay 14, and I need Dr. Osai." Aldridge hesitated, the audio channel hissing with static. "What are you planning to do with a broken alien shuttle, Commander?" Yale turned away from the glass. "I am going to fly it straight into the Emperor's living room." The silence on the War Council feed stretched tight enough to snap. Finally, Aldridge sighed, a sound that carried the exhaustion of a dying world. "You have authorization, Commander. God help us all. The shuttle is yours." 71 hours and 40 minutes remaining. Lunar Storage Bay 14 was a cavernous, poorly lit tomb usually reserved for decommissioned mining rigs. Now it was swarming with tech priests of the Defense Initiative, clustering around a teardrop of polished, obsidian-like metal. The Veth diplomatic shuttle, salvaged from a crash in the Kuiper Belt 3 years ago, looked like a predatory insect asleep on the concrete. Dr. Elias Osai was elbow-deep in the shuttle's exposed underbelly, swearing in 3 languages. He was a small, wire-thin man with nervous energy that vibrated out of him in constant, jerky movements. "Doctor," Yale called out, her boots clicking rhythmically against the metal grating as she approached. Osai smacked his head against a conduit, cursed again, and slid out from beneath the hull on a creeper. His lab coat was smeared with iridescent cobalt blue coolant. "Commander Dagen, tell me this is a drill. Please tell me Aldridge didn't actually greenlight this suicidal lunacy." "It's greenlit, Elias. Can you make it fly?" "Fly? Yes. Survive?" Osai wiped his forehead, leaving a streak of blue grease. "The propulsion systems are functional, barely. I've managed to patch the transponder core. To their sensors, we will broadcast as a high-ranking Veth emissary vessel returning from a deep space scouting run. But the moment they ping us for a biological scan, they'll see human heartbeats and blow us out of the sky. Then we spoof the bioscan. Yale said, stepping past him to run a gloved hand along the smooth, cold hull. You built the localized dampening fields for the Titan stealth subs. Shrink it. Mask our biological signatures with the shuttle's ambient radiation. That's theoretical. It's... Osai stopped, seeing the hard, unyielding geometry of her jawline in the dim light. He swallowed heavily. I have 71 hours to do it. You have 3, Yale corrected. We can't wait for the deadline. We launch while they're still settling into their blockade formation. The Emperor expects us to be paralyzed by fear, debating our surrender. We move before they start actively hunting anomalies. Osai stared at her, then turned to look at the alien craft. He let out a breathless, terrified laugh. 3 hours to hack a billion-year-old empire. Fine. Grab a hydrospanner, Commander. I need help recalibrating the primary manifold. For the next 3 hours, the hangar was a blur of frenetic, desperate engineering. Yale suited up in advanced stealth weave armor, securing an array of magnetic explosives and close-quarters thermal blades to her rig. She wasn't planning on fighting an army, but she wouldn't die empty-handed. Osai loaded a volatile, experimental logic virus into a portable command deck, his hand shaking as he secured it to his chest harness. 68 hours and 12 minutes remaining. The shuttle's engines whined to life, not with the roar of human combustion, but with a high-pitched harmonic hum that made Yale's teeth ache. The cockpit was cramped, lit by the sickly bioluminescent green of the Veth control consoles. Osai sat in the co-pilot seat, his fingers flying across a jury-rigged human keyboard wired directly into the alien dash. Dampening fields are active, Osai reported, his voice tight. Transponder is broadcasting the emissary code. We are invisible, mostly. Good, Yale said, taking the helm. The alien controls responded to her touch with terrifying smoothness. Control, this is Trojan 1. We are breaking Atmo. The hangar doors ground open, revealing the stark, starry void of space, and there, hanging like a storm cloud against the cosmos, was the Veth Armada. Yale pushed the throttle forward, and the sleek obsidian ship slipped out of the lunar shadow, a lone poisoned dart flying straight into the jaws of the Leviathan. The distance between the moon and the Veth Vanguard closed with agonizing slowness. Through the teardrop viewport, the Armada ceased to be a mere storm cloud and resolved into a terrifying architecture of war. Dreadnoughts the size of terrestrial cities drifted past, their hulls bristling with weapons batteries that could crack tectonic plates. The Obsidian shuttle, broadcasting its stolen emissary code, wove through the silent, staggered lines of the alien fleet. 67 hours, 40 minutes, Osai muttered, his eyes glued to his jury-rigged monitor. We're approaching the inner picket line, 2 heavy cruisers flanking our vector. Yale didn't blink, her hand steady on the smooth, gelatinous control nodes of the helm. Hold course. Emissaries don't yield. Suddenly, a blinding wave of amber light washed over the cockpit. The high-pitched hum of the engine hitched, whining in protest. Active scan, Osai hissed, his fingers flying over the human keyboard. They're pinging the transponder. The dampening field is fluctuating under the sheer wattage of their sensors. Compensate, Doctor. I'm trying. The ambient radiation is spiking. The amber light shifted to a deep, penetrating crimson. It felt as though the light itself was attempting to peel back Yale's skin to examine the marrow beneath. A heavy, synthesized pulse echoed through the shuttle's comms, a brutal digital interrogation demanding verification. Osai slammed a fist onto an override switch, feeding them the spoofed biometrics now. Come on, you bastards, take the bait. For 3 agonizing seconds, the crimson light held them in a vice. Yale mentally cycled through the detonation sequence for the magnetic explosives strapped to her armor. If they were made, she would try to take the cruisers with them. Then the light snapped back to a passive bioluminescent green. The comms fell silent. The cruisers drifted lazily away, parting like steel leviathans to let the tiny ship pass. Osai slumped back in his seat, exhaling a breath that sounded dangerously close to a sob. They bought it. We're officially cataloged as emissary vessel Syzygy, returning from a deep space pacification run. Keep breathing, Doctor. We aren't there yet, Yale said, her gaze fixed dead ahead. The throne ships loomed before them. It was a chaotic masterpiece of dark organic metal and pulsing vein-like conduits that glowed with a sickening rhythmic violet light. It dwarfed the dreadnoughts, a sprawling cathedral of void-born machinery. But as they drew closer, Osai sat up, his relief evaporating into fresh acute panic. He tapped furiously at a rapidly scrolling data feed on his screen. "Commander," he said, his voice trembling, "the logic virus I built is designed for a centralized silicon-based mainframe. But look at the energy readings bleeding off that throne ship. It's not just a ship, not entirely." Yale narrowed her eyes at the colossal structure, noting the way the violet lights pulsed in perfect biological synchronization. "Explain." "It's a biological nexus," Osai whispered, the color draining entirely from his face. "The hull is just a shell. The interior is neural tissue. The Emperor isn't just sitting in a command center, Yale. He's physically wired into the vessel's nervous system. If we want to plant the virus and crash the fleet, we can't just plug into a wall console. We have to tap directly into his central nervous system." "Then we get close," Yale said, her tone devoid of the panic Osai was drowning in. She didn't deviate a fraction of a degree from their approach vector. "Close?" Osai practically shrieked, clutching the portable command deck to his chest as if it could shield him. "We're talking about a physical wetware interface. I can't wirelessly transmit a localized logic bomb into a biological brain. We need to physically pierce his spinal column or a primary neural node. Adapt the delivery mechanism, Doctor. You have until we dock." The throne ship swallowed them. The massive structure didn't have blast doors. Instead, a cavernous fissure on its starboard hull dilated like a massive metallic pupil. The shuttle was pulled inside by a localized gravity tether that felt less like a tractor beam and more like a muscular contraction. They touched down with a soft, wet thud on a landing deck that possessed a slight, horrifying elasticity. Outside the viewport, the hangar was a biomechanical nightmare. Ribbed arches of dark, glossy bone supported ceilings woven with pulsing violet veins thick as tree trunks. Automated drone servitors, grotesque fusions of crustacean-like plating and weeping cybernetics, skittered along the walls, completely ignoring the freshly landed emissary vessel. Osai was frantically dismantling his payload, his hands moving in a blur as he stripped the silicon casing to expose the conductive interface wiring. "I'm routing the output through a direct neuroshunt," he muttered, snapping a jagged 6-inch conductive pin salvaged from the shuttle's comms relay onto the virus drive. He taped it off with frantic precision. "It's crude. It's basically a digital harpoon. We will have to drive it deep into his nervous tissue." "Understood," Yale said. She unsealed her stealth weave helmet, letting it retract seamlessly into her armored collar. The atmosphere bleeding into the cockpit from the hangar hissed through the vents. It smelled of heavy ozone, ammonia, and old coppery blood. 66 hours, 15 minutes, Yale noted. She reached to her thighs, drawing a pair of close-quarters thermal blades. She triggered the ignition rings. The matte black metal hummed instantly to life, the edges glowing with a fierce, white-hot lethality. She checked the magnetic explosives on her bandolier one last time. "Stay behind me, Elias, and keep that harpoon ready." Yale hit the release mechanism. The shuttle's boarding ramp lowered with a pneumatic hiss, spilling them out into the belly of the beast. The deck yielded beneath Yale's boots with a sickening membranous squelch. The atmosphere was stiflingly hot, pressing against them like a physical weight. As they moved away from the shuttle, the drone servitors continued their mindless maintenance, oblivious to the intruders. "Which way?" Osai whispered, his eyes darting frantically across the ribbed walls. He gripped the rigged logic virus so tightly his knuckles were white. Yale pointed one of her thermal blades toward the ceiling, where the massive violet-glowing conduits converged and pulsed. "It's a nervous system, Elias. We follow the thickest nerves to the brainstem, follow the pulse." They moved in silence through a labyrinth of biomechanical arteries. The architecture defied all human engineering. There were no right angles, only sweeping curves of bone-white cartilage and wet, dark muscular tissue that contracted rhythmically. The further they went, the louder the ambient heartbeat became, a deep, resonant thud that vibrated in Yale's molars. After 20 minutes of winding through the ship's grotesque anatomy, the corridor widened into a cavernous antechamber. Ahead, a massive sphincter-like door rimmed with razor-sharp calcifications blocked their path. Guarding it were two Veth Praetorians. Unlike the mindless drones in the hangar, these were true warriors. Towering 9 feet tall, they were clad in interlocking plates of deep obsidian chitin, holding heavy, crackling plasma halberds. Their faceted, multi-lensed eyes glowed with predatory intelligence. Osai froze, pressing his back against the fleshy wall. "Yale," he breathed, a barely audible squeak. "Stay in the shadows," Yale commanded softly. She tapped a note on her collar, engaging the stealth weave's active camouflage. To Osai, she shimmered and vanished, leaving only a faint distortion in the violet light. Yale closed the distance rapidly, her boots making zero sound on the spongy floor. The Praetorians stood statue still, unaware of the phantom approaching them. When she was within striking distance, she didn't hesitate. She materialized right between them. Her left blade drove upward, sliding seamlessly under the chin plate of the first guard and piercing its brainpan. Simultaneously, she swept her right blade in a brutal arc, severing the second Praetorian's weapon arm at the elbow before pivoting and burying the white-hot metal into its chest cavity. The kills were instant. The aliens collapsed with heavy, wet thuds, their caustic, pale yellow blood instantly cauterized by the thermal blades. Yale deactivated her camouflage, the air rippling as her armored form reappeared. She wiped the blades on a dry patch of chitin and gestured to the trembling scientist. "Clear, let's get this door open." Osai scurried forward, stepping carefully over the steaming corpses. He stared at the massive calcified sphincter blocking their path. "There's no control panel, Yale. It's muscular." Yale didn't reply. She jammed both thermal blades into the center of the fleshy aperture and wrenched her arms apart. The searing heat sliced through the thick rubbery tissue, the smell of burning meat instantly filling the antechamber. The muscular door convulsed, tearing open with a wet, agonizing screech that echoed down the organic halls. 65 hours, 40 minutes, Yale said, stepping through the smoldering gap. Osai followed, choking on the stench, and stopped dead. The throne room was vast, an echoing cathedral of bone and pulsing violet light. But there was no throne. At the center of the chamber hung Emperor Vethkaral, suspended in a web of thick, translucent neural cables that descended from the ceiling like the roots of a monstrous weeping tree. He was a colossal horror, his original bipedal form bloated and permanently fused with the ship's architecture. His eyes were milky and blind, but the massive, exposed cerebral cortex pulsating atop his head glowed with blinding violet energy. "You are loud, little parasites." The voice didn't come from the air. It exploded directly inside their minds, a crushing psychic weight that drove Osai to his knees, clutching his skull. Yale staggered, her vision swimming, but she locked her grip on her blades and forced herself upright. The Emperor's physical mouth didn't move, but the neural cables around him flared with intense light. "Did you think a stolen transponder could hide the primitive stench of your consciousness? I have felt you bleeding through my veins since you breached the hull." Around the perimeter of the circular room, shadows detached themselves from the walls. 6 more Praetorians, their halberds humming with lethal plasma, stepped into the violet light, sealing off the antechamber behind them. "Elias!" Yale shouted over the ringing in her head, ignoring the guards and locking her eyes on the massive exposed nerve cluster at the base of the Emperor's suspension web. "The harpoon! Get to the central node!" Osai scrambled forward on his hands and knees, the logic virus clutched tightly to his chest. Dark blood trickled from his nostrils, forced out by the sheer crushing weight of the Emperor's psychic presence. Yale didn't wait for the Praetorians to close the circle. She ripped a magnetic explosive from her bandolier and hurled it at the nearest pair. The blast was deafening in the enclosed chamber. It didn't shatter the room's shock-absorbent organic walls, but the concussive force blew the 2 guards off their feet, their obsidian chitin cracking under the impact. "Futile," the Emperor's voice mocked, a cold scalpel scraping against the inside of Yale's skull. "You bring fire to a god." Yale lunged. She parried a sweeping strike from a plasma halberd, the alien weapon sparking violently against her thermal blade with a hiss of displaced ozone. She spun inside the guard's immense reach, driving her left blade deep into its exposed armpit and slicing upward through its vital organs. Meanwhile, Osai crawled frantically toward the base of the Emperor's suspension web. The central node was a writhing mass of thick, blue-veined nerve tissue, throbbing in time with the ship's overarching heartbeat. The psychic static was deafening here, a localized gravity well of pure mental agony that threatened to rip his consciousness apart. "I'm at the node!" Osai screamed, tears of pain tracking through the blue grease on his face. He held up the rigged drive, the 6-inch conductive pin gleaming sharply in the violet light. "Do it!" Yale roared. A halberd grazed her shoulder, slicing through the advanced stealth weave armor and searing her flesh. Yale bit back a scream, pivoting her weight to shatter the offending Praetorian's knee joint with a brutal kick before burying her right blade into its chest cavity. 3 down, 3 to go. Osai raised the logic drive like a dagger, gripping it with both hands. He brought it down with all his meager strength. But just as the metal pin was about to pierce the soft nerve cluster, a translucent secondary membrane snapped shut over the node. It hardened instantly, turning from a fleshy veil into a calcified bone-white shell. "Did you think I would leave my heart exposed to parasites?" The Emperor laughed, a sound like grinding tectonic plates echoing in their minds. Osai slammed the pin against the shell. It sparked and bounced off, completely useless. He struck it again, sobbing in frustration. "Yale, it's sealed. It's solid bone. I can't pierce it." "Get clear," Yale bellowed, sidestepping a lethal arc of plasma from the 4th Praetorian. The weapon's ambient heat washed over her face, singeing her eyelashes. She slapped her second-to-last magnetic explosive squarely onto the Praetorian's breastplate, kicked it backward into the 5th guard, and dove into a tight roll. The localized detonation sent a shockwave of shattered obsidian chitin and pale yellow gore across the room. 2 more down. Only 1 Praetorian remained, but the blast had sent it reeling against the fleshy wall. Ignoring the staggering alien, Yale sprinted toward the base of the suspension web. The psychic pressure radiating from the Emperor grew exponential with every step, mimicking the feeling of deep ocean water pressure crushing her eardrums. A hot line of blood poured from her nose, matching Osai's. "Worms!" the Emperor hissed, the psychic voice dropping its arrogant drawl for sudden raw fury. "I will crush your minds before you can scratch my armor." Osai scrambled backward, clutching the rigged drive to his chest as Yale slid into the space he had just vacated. She looked at the smooth, calcified dome shielding the nerve cluster. It was thick, seamless, and designed to withstand heavy ordnance. She reversed her grip on both thermal blades. Crossing them at the hilts, she drove the white-hot edges directly into the apex of the bone-white shell. The heat immediately met immense resistance. The blades ground to a halt, the air filling with the noxious, blinding smoke of vaporized calcium, but she didn't let up. With a guttural scream, Yale threw the entirety of her body weight over the hilts, ignoring the blinding agony of her seared shoulder. The superheated metal bit deeper. Spiderweb fractures rapidly radiated outward from the impact point, the cracks glowing with intense internal heat. The Emperor roared, a physical deafening shriek that shook the massive chamber and caused the violet conduits above to flicker erratically. With a violent explosive crack, the calcified dome shattered into jagged shards, laying bare the soft, pulsing blue nerve cluster underneath. "Now, Elias!" Yale shouted. She ripped her blades free and spun around, stepping over the exposed node just as the final Praetorian, having recovered its footing, leveled its crackling plasma halberd for a fatal thrust. Yale met the descending plasma halberd with a desperate crossguard of her thermal blades. The impact drove her to her knees, the kinetic force traveling up her arms and threatening to dislocate her shoulders. The crackling plasma of the alien weapon hissed mere inches from her visor, the ambient heat beginning to melt the outer layers of her stealth weave gauntlets. She gritted her teeth, blood dripping from her, chin straining against the Praetorian's overwhelming physical strength. Behind her, Osai threw himself at the exposed nerve cluster. He didn't hesitate. Gripping the improvised logic drive with both hands, he drove the 6-inch conductive pin deep into the center of the pulsating blue tissue. It sank with a wet, fleshy tear, embedding itself all the way to the hilt. The Emperor's psychic fury spiked, a localized supernova of mental pressure that threatened to instantly scramble their frontal lobes. "I am the Dominion. I am eternal." "Execute!" Yale screamed, her arms buckling as the Praetorian forced the halberd closer to her throat. Osai slammed his palm onto the manual override switch of the logic drive. "Eat this, Your Majesty." The upload was instantaneous. The experimental logic virus, designed to endlessly replicate and corrupt the processing cycles of advanced silicon mainframes, violently flooded the Emperor's biological wetware. The reaction was catastrophic. The rhythmic, pulsing violet light of the throne room abruptly froze, then began to strobe in a violent, sickening, erratic green. The psychic pressure crushing their minds didn't just lift, it shattered into a million fragmented, agonizing shrieks. The Emperor convulsed in his suspension web, his massive, bloated form thrashing with terrifying violence. The translucent neural cables holding him aloft whipped and snapped like severed live wires, discharging massive arcs of bioelectric energy that scorched the bone-white walls. The Praetorian towering over Yale abruptly froze, its multi-lensed eyes flashing with the same corrupted green light flooding the chamber. With its neural link to the Emperor severed by the cascading virus, the behemoth's autonomous motor functions collapsed. It slumped backward, completely inert, the plasma halberd clattering harmlessly onto the spongy floor. Yale collapsed onto her side, gasping for breath, her thermal blades disengaging with a soft hiss. The throne room was tearing itself apart around them, the once rhythmic heartbeat of the vessel replaced by a chaotic, arrhythmic stutter. Osai scrambled backward as the exposed nerve cluster began to rapidly necroticize, dissolving into a foul-smelling neon-green sludge. "It's working!" he yelled over the deafening cacophony of tearing tissue and electrical discharges. "The virus is overriding his autonomic functions. It's broadcasting the corrupted signal through his neural link to the rest of the fleet." Yale forced herself to her feet, clutching her seared shoulder. The pain was blinding, a deep throbbing burn, but raw adrenaline kept her upright. Then the Armada is paralyzed, but this ship is dying with him. A massive chunk of the bone-white ceiling suddenly detached, crashing down exactly where the last Praetorian had stood seconds prior. The floor beneath their boots rippled violently, the membranous deck losing its elasticity and turning dangerously brittle as the vessel's biological support systems underwent rapid, catastrophic failure. "We need to go, Elias," Yale shouted. She grabbed the scientist by the shoulder of his lab coat, hauling him away from the thrashing, screeching monstrosity that was once Emperor Veth Karal, and dragged him toward the breached sphincter door. They sprinted back through the labyrinth of biomechanical arteries. The corridors, previously pulsing with a steady heartbeat, were now convulsing in terrifying, erratic spasms. The fleshy walls wept caustic yellow fluids, and the air grew thick with the suffocating stench of rotting tissue and ozone. Osai panted heavily, nearly tripping over an inert drone servitor that had collapsed in the center of the hall, its cybernetic limbs sparking uselessly. "I don't think they're going to make that deadline." "Save your breath for the run," Yale commanded, refusing to slow down. The tremors grew more violent with every step, the entire colossal structure groaning as it began to list heavily. The internal gravity fluctuated wildly, making them feel momentarily weightless before slamming them back down against the hardening deck. When they finally burst back into the cavernous hangar, the sight through the massive, still-open launch aperture made Yale's breath catch. Outside, the invincible Veth Armada was descending into utter chaos. The dreadnoughts and heavy cruisers, previously locked in a perfect, terrifying blockade, were drifting blindly like dead leviathans. Several had already drifted into one another's vectors, their hulls buckling in massive, silent explosions of fire and venting atmosphere. The logic virus had severed the fleet from its god mind, leaving thousands of city-sized warships completely inert in the void. But their victory would be a tomb if they didn't move. The throne ship itself let out a final, agonizing structural groan. The ribbed arches holding the hangar ceiling aloft began to crack, raining jagged shards of bone down upon the obsidian emissary shuttle. Yale shoved Osai up the shuttle's boarding ramp just as a massive slab of calcified bone crushed the membranous deck where they had been standing a second before. She dove in after him, slamming her fist onto the emergency retraction override. The pneumatic ramp hissed shut, sealing them inside the cramped cockpit. Osai scrambled into the co-pilot seat, his hands flying across the jury-rigged human keyboard. The dampening fields are offline. The primary manifold is failing. We have raw thrust and absolutely nothing else. That's all we need, Yale grunted, dropping into the pilot seat and ignoring the searing agony radiating from her shoulder. She gripped the gelatinous control nodes, feeling the shuttle hum to life beneath her. Through the viewport, the massive hangar aperture was closing. It wasn't sealing by design, but because the biological ship was undergoing a catastrophic death spasm. The muscular walls were violently contracting, rapidly narrowing their only exit. "Hold on," Yale warned. She shoved the throttle to absolute maximum. The obsidian shuttle shot forward like a bullet from a gun. They tore through the crumbling hangar, dodging falling debris and the inert husks of drone servitors. The aperture was shrinking rapidly, a jagged maw of dying flesh and sparking metal. Yale didn't flinch. She angled the nose down, clipping the lower edge of the closing fissure with a violent scrape of metal on bone, and burst out into the freezing vacuum of space. The view was apocalyptic. The once-ordered Veth blockade was a sprawling graveyard of colliding titans. Massive cruisers drifted aimlessly, their weapon batteries silent, crashing into one another in spectacular, soundless eruptions of plasma and shattered armor. The throne ship behind them began to violently implode, its conduits flashing one final, brilliant green before the entire colossal structure collapsed, inward on itself, dying in the dark. Osai slumped back in his chair, staring out the viewport at the devastation. He looked down at his trembling hands, covered in blue coolant, caustic alien gore, and his own blood. A hysterical, breathless chuckle escaped his lips. 64 hours and 12 minutes remaining on the deadline, Commander. Yale allowed herself a slow, exhausted exhale, her grip finally relaxing on the alien controls. She reached out and flipped the comms relay to the encrypted emergency War Council feed, steering them through a wide gap between two drifting dreadnoughts. "Control, this is Trojan 1, Yale said, her voice steady and quiet amidst the static. "The Emperor is dead. The blockade is broken. We are coming home." For a long moment, there was nothing but the hiss of deep space over the channel. Then General Aldridge's voice broke through the static, thick with disbelief and the impossible weight of salvation. "Copy that, Trojan 1. We see it. Godspeed, Commander, and welcome back."